The sun was setting fast over the Texas plains, staining the horizon with streaks of copper and red. Heat still lingered in the air, but the wind had changed. Cooler now, as if the land itself was bracing for something. So was she. Her name was Joanna Hale, and she hadn't looked back in over 40 miles. Behind her, an old wagon creaked with every bump in the dirt road, pulled by a horse more stubborn than strong. Inside the wagon sat her 2 children, Mira, 6, with tangled hair and silent eyes, and Evan, not yet 2, asleep in a bundle of quilts that still smelled like the home they'd fled. Joanna's hands gripped the reins too tightly. Her knuckles were scraped and a bruise bloomed along the edge of her jaw. But she was moving. That was all that mattered. She didn't have a plan, only distance and prayer. The town up ahead, Dry Creek, was a dot on a map she'd memorized weeks ago. A place too small for rumors, too tired for questions. That's what she needed. Quiet. Shelter. A chance to breathe before deciding who she'd have to become next. As the wagon rolled into town, folks stopped to stare. Not rudely, just curiously. A woman alone, with 2 children, no man in sight. That wasn't something you saw often, even out here. But Joanna held her chin up. She nodded when nodded to. She didn't shrink. At the edge of town, just before the last storefront faded into dry pasture, a broad-shouldered man stepped out from the feed store. He had the kind of presence that didn't shout. He didn't wear a badge, didn't carry a rifle on his back, but something about the way he looked at her, steady, unreadable, not flinching at the sight of the bruise on her face, made her slow the horse. "You just passing through?" he asked. His voice was deep, low, with that sandpaper drawl that made everything sound older than it was. Joanna looked him over. He was dressed plainly, dusty jeans, sun-faded shirt, and a wide-brimmed hat that shadowed half his face. "I'm looking for work," she said, "and a place to lay low for a while." "You got family?" She hesitated. "No." He nodded once, like that confirmed what he already figured. "I've got a bunkhouse," he said, "and a garden that needs weeding. Pays little. Keeps you fed." Joanna narrowed her eyes. "You don't know me." He didn't blink. "You're tired," he said. "Your daughter hasn't spoken in 3 days, and your boy's outgrowing the coat he's wearing. That's all I need to know today." Joanna felt her throat tighten. She didn't speak. Didn't trust herself to, but she nodded. He gestured toward the long stretch of land just past the town. "Name's Colt Bennett. Ranch is mine. You're safe now." Those 3 words, "You're safe now." No man had ever said that to her before, and meant it. She swallowed hard, nodded again, and clicked the reins gently. Colt turned and walked ahead of the wagon, leading her home without another word. That night, after the children were bathed and fed, and the bunkhouse smelled faintly of wood smoke and biscuits, Joanna sat alone by the window. Colt hadn't asked questions. He hadn't hovered. He'd just nodded, handed her a key, and said, "You lock it, if you want to." She had. But now, looking at her children sleeping peacefully for the first time in months, she realized something strange. She didn't feel like she had to. The sun rose slow over the dry Texas earth, casting long gold fingers across the ridge. Inside the bunkhouse, Joanna was already awake, boots laced, apron tied, hair braided tight. She didn't sleep much. Not yet. Sleep was a luxury for those who'd forgotten how it felt to run. She stepped outside just as the first light touched the porch. Mira followed silently, still in her nightgown, clutching the same ragged doll she hadn't let go of since Arkansas. "You hungry?" Joanna asked gently. Mira shook her head, but she stayed close. Joanna looked out across the land. Rows of fences, a windmill creaking, and in the distance, Colt Bennett, walking the fence line with a post over his shoulder like it weighed nothing. He didn't wave, he didn't call out, but he saw her and nodded, just once. That morning, after she got Evan settled with a biscuit and a crate of toys in the shade, Joanna approached the barn where a few hired men were loading feed. Colt was inside repairing a busted latch on the stall door. "I came to work," she said without preamble. He didn't look up. "Didn't think you came to rest." She took a step closer. "I don't want charity." "Good," he said, tightening the bolt. "I'm not offering any." She paused. "What are you offering?" He finally looked up. "Space, time, a little quiet, and the option not to explain anything you're not ready to." Joanna's throat tightened again. She wasn't used to silence being kind. She wasn't used to any of this. "I can clean," she said. "Sew, tend garden. I know how to ride, but not pretty. And I don't scare easy." Colt set his wrench down. "You scared enough to run, that counts." She didn't answer. Didn't need to. He just nodded toward the side door. "Start with the garden. You'll find gloves and a straw hat on the nail." Water's already drawing. Don't let the squash fool you. They'll strangle everything if you turn your back. The garden was wild, but manageable, like her. She worked in the heat with Mira beside her, silent but watching. Evan napped in the shade, mouth open, cheeks pink from the warm air. And for the first time in weeks, Joanna's shoulders began to loosen. Not fall, not collapse, just loosen, as if her body believed something her mind hadn't caught up to yet. They were safe. Colt came by later that afternoon, carrying a tin of lemonade and 2 chipped mugs. Joanna wiped her brow with the back of her hand. I thought ranchers didn't bring drinks to the help. He shrugged. I don't think of you as help. She narrowed her eyes, guarded. Then what am I? He took a long sip before answering. A storm survivor. Storms don't scare me. They teach me where to build better next time. Joanna looked down, then back at him. There were no sparks, no romance in the air, no blushing or flirtation, just honesty. And for her, that was more intimate than any touch. That night, as the children slept, Joanna found herself standing at the bunkhouse window again, watching Colt walk back toward his house in the distance. Back straight, pace slow. He hadn't tried to impress her. He hadn't tried to fix her. He hadn't tried anything, and somehow that was what made her start to trust him. Just a little. Just enough. To hope that maybe, just maybe, this place wasn't temporary. The next day began like the one before. Sunlight spilling slowly across the plains, the rooster crowing from somewhere behind the barn, and the scent of dust rising from the earth even before it was fully warm. Joanna stood at the small stove in the bunkhouse, kneading dough on the floured table while Evan babbled in the corner, busy stacking wooden blocks. Mira sat quietly, reading the same picture book for the 3rd time, her lips moving without sound, eyes flicking toward the window every few minutes like she was making sure the world hadn't turned on them again. Joanna shaped the dough into small loaves, slid them into the cast-iron oven, then stepped out onto the porch. The morning air held that sharp edge of summer not yet settled. Hot, but not still. Colt was already at work as always. He was mending the paddock fence, driving nails with calm rhythm. Sweat clung to his shirt, but his pace never rushed. When Joanna came into view, he paused, lifted his head, and gave her that quiet nod she was starting to expect and count on. She walked toward him with a small wrapped parcel in hand. Bread? She said, holding it out. Still warm? He took it without reaching too quickly, like he didn't want to startle her. You didn't have to, he said. I didn't, she replied, but I did. He smiled, the kind that only touched the corners of his mouth. Fair enough. They stood in silence for a few beats. Then Colt said, You ever think about staying longer? She looked up at him sharply. Longer than what? He shrugged, eyes fixed on the post he'd just set. Longer than until you're ready to run again. Joanna didn't answer right away. She wasn't sure she could. Instead, she asked, You ever been hit? Colt blinked. You mean in a fight? I mean by someone who swore they loved you. A beat. Then Colt said quietly, Yes. Joanna froze. She hadn't expected that. I was 16, he went on. My stepfather had a hand like a barn door and a temper that showed up before he did. What happened? One day I got taller than him. That changed things. Joanna stared at the ground. It doesn't always. No, he said, it doesn't. She lifted her chin then, her voice calm but low. I won't let my daughter think bruises are part of being held. She won't, Colt said without hesitation. Joanna's breath caught in her chest, tight and unexpected. And for the first time in a very long time, she believed someone when they told her that. Later that evening, Mira followed Colt to the edge of the garden while he checked on the watering lines. She didn't say much, just walked beside him, doll in hand, eyes sharp. At one point, she tugged his sleeve. He looked down. Do you have a gun? She asked. I do. Would you use it? I would. To keep us safe? He crouched to her level, quiet, serious. Yes, but only if I had to. Most things, he said, you fix with hands and words. But if it ever came to that, I'd protect you. And your mama. Always. Mira stared at him for a long moment, then nodded, and walked back to the porch. That night, Joanna found her daughter asleep, peaceful, curled against her little brother. And for the first time since leaving the life she'd nearly drowned in, she didn't double-check the locks before going to bed, because something stronger than the door was guarding them now. A man who didn't raise his voice, didn't take what wasn't offered, and didn't ask for anything but the truth. The days passed with the gentle rhythm of ranch life, sun-up, chores, quiet meals, and early nights. Joanna found peace in the pattern, even when her muscles ached and her hands grew calloused. It was a different kind of exhaustion. Earned, not inflicted. Colt kept his distance but not his presence. He was always near, sharpening tools, repairing hinges, lifting feed bags with ease. He never hovered, never questioned, and never touched. That, more than anything, made Joanna feel seen. One afternoon, as she swept the porch, Joanna noticed a weathered tin box tucked behind a loose floorboard. Curious, she knelt, pried it free, and opened the lid. Inside were old letters, all written in a woman's delicate hand. She skimmed the top one. "Dear Colt, I hope this letter finds you before the winter sets in. The apples are drying well, and Mama's been sewing again. We miss you. Come home soon." "Come." Joanna's brow furrowed. She flipped through a few more, letters full of warmth, hopes, and stories from someone who clearly loved him. But none were opened. None had been sent. And none had been read. That evening, as Colt unloaded hay from the wagon, Joanna approached, tin box in hand. "I found these under the porch," she said. He froze, turned slowly, eyes falling on the box. "I didn't read them all," she added. "Just enough to know they weren't mine to find." He took the box gently, looked down at it for a long while. Then he said, "They were for my sister, Sarah. She died 3 winters ago. Never made it out of the canyon when the storm came down fast." Joanna's breath caught. "I'm sorry. She used to write letters even when I was just out in the fields," he said, voice rough around the edges. "Said paper held things better than memory." Joanna nodded. "Maybe it does." They stood there, dusk settling around them like a soft quilt. Then Colt added, "I never could throw 'em away, but I never could read 'em either." Joanna looked at him, truly looked, and saw something she hadn't noticed before. Grief, quiet, weathered, but still living inside him like an ember that never cooled. She didn't speak. She didn't offer comfort. She just stood beside him, letting the silence speak for them both. The next morning, Joanna woke early, restless. She stepped outside barefoot, the ground cool beneath her soles. The sky was still gray, birds just beginning their songs. Colt was already up, leaning against the fence, sipping coffee from a tin mug. "You don't sleep much either," she said. "I rest when the land rests," he replied. She walked to stand beside him, arms folded. "I used to write letters too," she said. "To no one. To the woman I hoped I'd be if I ever got away." "Did you keep them?" She shook her head. "Burned them all. Thought if anyone ever found them, he'd know I planned to leave." Colt didn't flinch. "You made it out anyway?" "Barely. That's still out." They stood there for a while, watching the light change. Then Colt said something that stayed with her for days. "Sometimes we don't get to choose who we bury, but we do get to choose who we plant seeds with." Joanna didn't answer. But that morning, after the chores were done and the children were fed, she went out to the garden and began planting. Not just pulling weeds, because maybe, just maybe, this land could grow something new. Not just food, but safety and belonging and love. The skies broke open 2 days later, not with thunder or fury, but with a slow, steady rain that washed the dust from the world and soaked deep into the thirsty earth. On the porch of the bunkhouse, Joanna sat wrapped in Colt's old wool blanket, her children curled beside her like kittens. Mira leaned against her shoulder. Evan clutched his mother's braid like it was a lifeline. The rain made the roof whisper and the fields sing. Joanna hadn't heard that sound in so long, the sound of water that wasn't followed by fear. No footsteps stomping through wet halls, no slammed doors, no yelling, just rain. And that, she thought, might be the most peaceful thing she'd ever known. Colt appeared mid-morning, hat dripping, shirt clinging to his frame, boots caked with fresh mud. "You okay?" he asked from the porch steps, eyeing the children. "We're good," Joanna replied, voice soft but steady. He held up a cloth bundle. "Biscuits from Lita at the cafe. She said you're too skinny." Joanna smiled. "Did you agree?" "I said it's not my business to tell a woman what to eat." She raised a brow. "Smart answer." He gave a slow shrug. "I learn slow, but I learn." She bit into a biscuit, warm and buttery. Mira leaned over for a bite, and Colt, without being asked, handed her one of her own. Mira hesitated, then took it. Then, miracle of miracles, she smiled. It was small, faint, but it was real. And Joanna saw it. Later that afternoon, the rain still falling light and constant, Colt brought a pile of old wooden scraps to the barn. "I was going to burn 'em," he said to Joanna as she joined him, curious. "But I figured the kids might get more use if I built something." "What are you building?" He looked over his shoulder. "You tell me." She folded her arms. "You always answer questions with questions?" "Only the ones I'm afraid of answering wrong." That made her laugh. "For real." A short, surprised sound that slipped out before she could catch it. Colt stopped what he was doing and looked up at her. "That's the first time I've heard you laugh." Joanna flushed, brushing her hair back. "It surprised me too." "You should do it more." She gave him a long, unreadable look. "I don't remember how." He didn't smile, didn't joke. He just said, Then we'll take it slow. I've got time. By sundown, the scraps had become a crude but sturdy playpen Evan could toddle around in without finding every sharp edge in a 10-mile radius. Joanna leaned against the barn door, arms crossed, watching Colt hammer the last nail. You didn't have to do this, she said. I didn't, he agreed, but I wanted to. She tilted her head. You always do what you want? No, he said, meeting her gaze. But I've learned to do what's kind. Life's too short to pretend that's not the same thing. Joanna felt something shift inside her again. Not fast, not loud, just a little deeper, like a root stretching into new ground. That night, after the children were asleep and the bunkhouse filled with the scent of rain-damp wood, Joanna sat by the oil lamp writing in a small journal she'd picked up at the general store. It wasn't a letter to anyone. It wasn't a prayer. It was a beginning, a place to put the laughter, and the biscuits, and the man who built things without asking for anything in return. She didn't know where this story was going yet, but for the first time since she ran, she wanted to find out. The air was cooler the next morning, the kind of crisp that whispered of autumn not far behind. Mist clung to the grass as Joanna stepped out to hang laundry. Mira skipped ahead with clothespins in hand, her hair tied back with a bit of Colt's old bandana. Evan wobbled beside them, one sock missing and a face full of biscuit crumbs. They looked like a family, but Joanna reminded herself not to say it out loud. Not yet. She turned toward the barn just as Colt stepped out, wiping oil from his hands. Their eyes met, and for the first time he smiled first. That afternoon, while Colt repaired the wheel on the supply wagon, Joanna brought him water. She waited while he set his tools down, watching him work with steady hands and quiet focus. You ever think about leaving? She asked out of nowhere. He glanced at her. Leaving what? This place, Texas. Starting over somewhere no one knows your name. Colt looked toward the hills. I did, he said. A long time ago. But it turns out, no one really knows my name anywhere. Not even me. I had to stay still long enough to figure it out. Joanna nodded slowly. I keep thinking I've escaped, she said. But sometimes it still feels like I'm running, even when I'm standing still. Colt's voice was low. That's not running. That's remembering. They feel the same. She looked at him sharply. Did someone teach you that? He hesitated. A woman. Long time ago. She left me a note when she left. Joanna didn't ask more. She could feel in her bones that the wound still echoed. Instead, she said quietly, I never told Mira's father I was pregnant. Colt looked up at her, his gaze steady but soft. He'd already broken too much in me. I wasn't going to let him touch something new. Joanna stared at her hands, pale against the chipped tin cup. I think I'm still learning where the cracks are, Colt replied. Cracks let the light in. That's how I know you're not broken. Just lit from the inside. The words settled deep in her chest, unfamiliar and warm. She didn't speak, but she stayed. That was answer enough. Later that evening, Colt sat on the porch while Evan crawled around his boots, chasing moths with sticky hands. Mira brought him a drawing, 2 stick figures, one tall, one small, holding hands in front of a house. This you and me? He asked gently. No, she said. That's you and Mama. I'm in the window. Colt looked again. Why are you in the window? Because I'm watching. I didn't know if it was okay to come out yet. He paused, then turned the paper over and drew something himself. A third figure, small, running outside with arms wide. Mira smiled, then nodded. That night, long after the children were asleep, Joanna sat outside alone, wrapped in Colt's old blanket. He joined her after a while, sitting on the steps without a word. They listened to the wind through the grass, the quiet of the ranch, the calm. And just when Joanna thought he might leave, he said, You're not someone I pity, Joanna. You're someone I admire, because you didn't stay where it was safe for him. You left to find what was safe for them. Joanna felt tears rise but didn't blink them away. For once she let them fall, and beside her Colt stayed quiet. Not to avoid the pain, but to honor it. The days were getting shorter now, and the breeze carried the scent of mesquite and smoke. Colt had started stacking wood beside the bunkhouse, preparing for the coming cold. He worked quietly, as always, but Joanna noticed something different in the way he moved. Slower, more deliberate. Not the way a man hurries through a chore, but the way someone makes time for what matters. That evening, Joanna tucked Mira and Evan in early. Mira no longer needed to be coaxed into bed with lullabies whispered like apologies. Evan had started giggling in his sleep, small sounds like echoes of something he hadn't known before. Safety. Joanna stood by the door for a long moment, just watching them. Then, for the first time since arriving, she didn't tiptoe to the couch. She walked to the small bed she hadn't dared use, and lay down, not in fear, not in exhaustion, but because she wanted to sleep. Outside, Colt fed the horses under the glow of a full moon. One of the mares nickered softly as he moved past, her breath steaming in the cold. He looked up toward the bunkhouse window, saw no movement, no shadows pacing, no flickering candle at midnight. He smiled to himself. "She's sleeping," he said aloud, as though telling the stars. The next morning, Joanna stepped out with hair unbraided and eyes clear. She blinked at the light, momentarily confused by the stillness in her chest. It took her a moment to name it. Peace. Colt met her halfway to the barn, tipping his hat. "Morning," he said. She paused. "I slept. I noticed." "You watched?" "I didn't mean to. I just listen for things, that's all." Joanna nodded. "What did you usually listen for?" He thought for a moment. "Trouble, coyotes, regret." She studied him. "And what did you hear last night?" He looked her in the eye. "Hope," breathing soft and steady. Joanna looked away, her cheeks pink. Then, surprising them both, she reached out and touched his arm. Just for a second, but it was a beginning. Later that day, Colt invited her and the kids into the main house. Just once. Just to sit by the big fireplace as the first chill rolled in. Mira curled up in a corner chair, reading. Evan made a fort of blankets under the coffee table. Joanna traced her fingers along the mantel, where dusty picture frames told stories Colt hadn't yet shared. She paused at one photo, a much younger Colt, beside a smiling girl with 2 missing teeth and eyes just like his. "Your sister?" she asked. He nodded. "Sarah." "She's still here," Joanna said quietly. Colt met her gaze. "Yeah, and now so are you." Joanna didn't answer. But in that moment, for the first time in a long time, she believed it. The fireplace crackled softly, sending golden light dancing across the wooden walls of the ranch house. Joanna sat cross-legged on a worn rug, Mira curled beside her with a tattered book open on both their laps. Evan had fallen asleep in Colt's old armchair, a blanket half draped over him and one small sock missing again. Colt sat near the fire, sharpening a blade but barely paying attention to the rhythm. His eyes kept flicking to Joanna, and not just out of habit anymore. There was something different tonight. A quietness that didn't feel heavy. A silence that didn't ache. Joanna looked up from the book and found his eyes waiting for hers. "Did you always want this life?" she asked softly. Colt set the blade down. "The quiet?" She nodded. "At first I thought I hated it," he admitted. "After the war, after Sarah, the silence was too loud." He leaned back in his chair, gaze drifting toward the fire. "But over time I learned it's not about what the silence takes from you. It's about what it gives room for." Joanna listened carefully. The fire snapped once, then settled into a slow rhythm. "Like what?" she asked. He looked at her, really looked, like healing. Later that night, the wind picked up outside, rattling the windows and making the trees groan in protest. The children were tucked in the spare bedroom of the main house. Colt had insisted. No one should sleep cold on a night like this. Joanna stepped out onto the front porch with a lantern, blanket wrapped around her shoulders. She didn't hear Colt until he stepped up beside her, holding 2 steaming mugs of cider. He offered her one. She took it without a word. The wind howled, but they stood shoulder to shoulder, facing it. "I used to be terrified of storms," Joanna said. Colt didn't ask why. He didn't need to. "But this one," she continued, "feels different." "How so?" "Because it's out there," she said, gesturing toward the hills. "And I'm in here. I finally feel like I'm on the right side of the door." Colt said nothing, just lifted his mug in a silent toast. Joanna clinked hers gently against it. "To the right side of the door," she whispered. Before they turned in for the night, Colt walked her to the guest room. He paused in the doorway, rubbing the back of his neck like he was holding something in. "Joanna," she turned toward him, hand still on the doorframe. "I'm not trying to push you into anything, but I want you to know, this house, this place, it's not just mine anymore." Her breath caught. "It's yours too, if you want it." Joanna looked at him for a long moment, and for once her first instinct wasn't to run. It was to stay. Because for the first time, no one was demanding anything from her. No one was expecting her to give what she didn't have. She could just be. And being was finally enough. "I'm not ready," she said truthfully. Colt nodded. "Then I'll keep the fire going until you are." And he did. All night long. Morning came slow and silver, the kind of light that filters through curtains like a promise. Joanna opened her eyes to the quietest sound, children breathing in rhythm. Mira lay curled up at the far end of the bed, her hair tangled, her stuffed rabbit tucked under her chin. Evan had burrowed beside Joanna sometime in the night, one chubby arm thrown across her stomach, and she had slept. No nightmares, no jerking awake, no reaching for the dark. Just sleep. It was the kind of rest she used to believe she'd never find again. In the kitchen, Colt was already making breakfast, quietly, so as not to wake anyone. He moved around like someone who understood the importance of silence, who knew that peace was a thing you didn't create, but protected. Joanna stepped in, her hair still loose from the night, sleeves rolled up to her elbows. "You cook?" she asked, smiling as she noticed the biscuit dough and eggs on the stove. He nodded, not looking up. "Enough to keep from starving. Lucky us." He finally glanced at her, and for a second he just stared. Something in the way she looked that morning, barefoot, relaxed, standing in his kitchen with sleepy eyes and a soft smile, caught him off guard. "You look," he started. Joanna tilted her head, curious, but Colt shook his head, half smirking. "Never mind. That's not my business." Joanna stepped closer, eyes steady. "You sure about that?" His smile faded slowly. "No, I'm not." And they both let the silence say the rest. They spent the day doing small things, washing clothes, mending Mira's dress, teaching Evan how to hold a stick like a horse's reins. Colt fixed the creaky step on the porch. Joanna helped him lift the lumber. At one point, he accidentally brushed her hand, and neither of them pulled away. When the sun dipped low, they sat under the cottonwood tree behind the house. Joanna leaned against the trunk, Mira braiding grass nearby, Evan asleep in her lap. Colt crouched beside her, resting on one knee. "Do you miss anyone?" Joanna asked suddenly. He didn't flinch. "Sometimes." "Family?" He nodded. "Lost my folks when I was a boy. Raised my sister after that. Lost her too." "I'm sorry. I was angry for a long time," he admitted. "Thought maybe I was meant to be alone. Safer that way." Joanna looked down at Evan's fingers curled around hers. "I used to believe the same thing." Colt glanced at her. "Still do?" She shook her head. "No, I think I was just waiting to feel safe enough to stop believing it." And he said in the quietest voice, "You're safe now." The words settled in her bones like warmth, not because he said them, but because she believed them, for the first time. That night, Joanna didn't return to the guest room. She tucked the children into their cots in Colt's house, then sat by the fireplace with him, feet bare, a mug of tea in hand, and no hurry in her heart. They didn't touch. They didn't need to, because being there, together, in the stillness, was already more intimate than anything she'd known in years. And when she finally went to bed, she left the door open. Just a little. Just enough. The days grew shorter. Crisp air carried the scent of drying hay and old pine, and the porch creaked beneath the weight of quiet moments that meant more than words. Colt had begun sleeping in the barn loft again, not because he had to, but because he sensed that Joanna and the children needed the house more than he did. But every morning, when Joanna stepped into the kitchen, the stove was already warm, a pot of coffee, biscuits rising, a folded blanket on the rocker, hers now. It was never spoken. It just was. One morning, Mira came running in with a piece of wood in her hand, shaped like a heart. "Colt carved it for me," she shouted, proud. "It has my name on it." Joanna turned the wooden heart over in her fingers. Sure enough, etched carefully across the center was Mira. "He said everyone needs something with their name on it," the girl said seriously, "so you don't forget you belong." Joanna blinked hard. Later that day, Colt caught her watching him as he worked the horses. She approached quietly, arms folded. "You always been this kind to people you barely know?" she asked. "No," he answered simply. "So what makes us different?" He didn't turn to her right away, then said, "You're not strangers, not anymore." She smiled softly. "Neither are you." That evening, Evan sat on Colt's lap in the barn, squealing with laughter as Colt held him up to let him ride the saddle set on a post. The boy beamed, his little fists gripping the worn horn like he was on top of the world. Joanna stood at the doorway, arms crossed, lips pressed together to keep from crying. She couldn't remember the last time Evan had laughed like that, or the last time she had. When they returned to the house, Colt paused before stepping inside. "I can sleep out back if you need space," he said, brushing dust from his sleeves. Joanna looked at him for a long moment. Then finally, "I don't want space. I want you near. Just don't expect more than that yet." Colt's eyes softened. "I never will." He took off his hat, nodded once, and followed her inside. Not like a man invited, but like a man who'd already been there in all the ways that mattered. That night, as the fire flickered low, Joanna walked into the front room where Colt sat with a book open on his lap. She didn't speak, just pulled the blanket off the back of the rocker and laid it gently across his shoulders. Then, for the first time, she kissed his temple, light as breath, warm as trust. Colt didn't move, didn't speak, but a line between his shoulders, one that had been there for years, finally relaxed. And for Joanna, it wasn't just a gesture. It was a beginning. Because sometimes, healing didn't come with grand declarations. It came with small things. A folded blanket, a carved name, a touch that said, "You're not alone anymore." A week later, a cold wind swept down from the north, tearing yellow leaves from the trees and rattling the window panes of the old ranch house. It was the kind of weather that made everything feel fragile, like silence could snap if you touched it too hard. Inside, the fireplace roared to life. Joanna stood barefoot on the wooden floor, wrapping a shawl tighter around her shoulders as she stirred a pot of stew. Mira was drawing pictures at the table, humming softly to herself. Evan napped in the corner, wrapped in the blanket Colt had first given them when they arrived. And Colt was mending the latch on the back door. Again. "You know," Joanna said without turning, "you've fixed that door 3 times this week." Colt looked up, holding a hammer loosely. "Guess I like keeping things from breaking again." Joanna's lips curved into something close to a smile. Not bright, not forced, just real. "Some things still creak, no matter how hard you try," she said, voice softer now. He met her eyes. "And some things just need time to settle into place." That evening, after supper and dishes and a round of laughter over Evan's stubborn refusal to eat carrots, Joanna stepped out onto the front porch alone. The wind had calmed, but clouds still rolled heavy over the moon. She sat in the rocking chair Colt had repaired for her, and she waited, not for danger, not for the next storm, but for peace to land and stay. And it did, because a moment later, Colt stepped outside, pulling his coat tight, and handed her a tin mug of cider. "Kids asleep?" he asked. Joanna nodded. Mira said her drawing today was a picture of a family. He arched a brow. "Yours?" Joanna took a long sip, then looked straight ahead. "Ours." They sat in silence for a while, watching the trees sway gently under a night sky scrubbed clean. Then Colt asked, "You ever think about what comes next?" Joanna was quiet then. "All the time, but for once, not with fear." She looked over at him. "You?" He hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah, but only if you're part of it." Her breath caught slightly, but she didn't look away. "I'm not the same woman who stepped off that train." "I know," he said. "You're stronger now. I'm also still healing." "I'll wait," he whispered, "as long as it takes." Joanna reached out and placed her hand over his. "You already have." Inside the house, the fire cracked. Outside, 2 figures sat close beneath a blanket of stars. And somewhere between the wind and the warmth, they realized something neither of them had dared to say out loud yet. They weren't waiting anymore. They were living again, together. The first snow arrived in the middle of the night. A soft hush blanketed the land, muting even the hooves of the horses outside. It wasn't loud or sudden. It came like a breath held too long, finally released. Joanna woke to the soft, white glow pressing in through the window. She rose slowly, careful not to disturb Evan sleeping next to her. Mira, in her own bed now, slept facing the wall, one arm draped over her sketchbook. Joanna pulled on her shawl and stepped outside. The porch creaked under her bare feet. The world was white. Still, clean. Whole. Colt was already out by the fence, his dark coat a stark contrast against the snow. He turned when he heard her steps, eyes lifting from the ground to meet hers. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. She walked toward him, feet crunching snow, stopping just a breath away. For a long moment, neither moved. Then Joanna said softly, "I haven't looked at snow in years without feeling afraid." Colt's brows lowered. "Why afraid?" "Because every time it came, I didn't know if we'd survive the season. No heat, no food, no safety." She reached out, not to take his hand, but to brush snow off his shoulder. "This is the first winter that doesn't feel like a punishment." Colt exhaled slowly, almost as if he had been holding that same fear and didn't know it. "You're not there anymore," he said gently. "No," she replied, "I'm not." Later that day, while the children made uneven snowmen in the yard, Joanna found an old box in the barn marked with Colt's name. She opened it to find photos, faded letters, a child's drawing labeled, "To Big Brother," and a broken locket with a picture of a young woman inside. "Sarah," Joanna whispered. Colt stood behind her. "I kept thinking I needed to carry her memory like a weight," he said. "But maybe it was meant to be something lighter." "She was your family," Joanna said, closing the box. "She always will be." "She'd like you," he murmured. "She'd say I got lucky." Joanna turned, eyes shining. "Did you?" "I think I did." That night, as the snow thickened, Colt lit a second fire in the main room. Not for warmth, for gathering. Joanna came with Mira holding her sketch pad, and Evan wrapped in 2 blankets like a little king. They played cards by the fire, laughed at Colt's terrible sleight of hand, and told ghost stories too gentle to scare. When the kids drifted off, Joanna leaned into Colt's shoulder and whispered, "I think I'm ready." He didn't ask for what. He just held her hand. Because he knew. And in that quiet, between firelight and snowfall, Joanna let go of everything she had been forced to carry. Grief, guilt, fear, and the haunting ache of a life half lived. She didn't announce it. She didn't need to. She let go without saying a word. The snow didn't melt the next morning, nor the one after. It stayed, soft and deep, a quiet reminder that the land was changing, slowing down, breathing differently. So did Joanna. She no longer rushed to do everything first. She let Colt beat her to the stove now and then, let Mira mess up the sewing box without scolding, let Evan cry when he missed things he couldn't name. And for the first time in years, she stopped apologizing for needing rest. One evening, after the kids had fallen asleep near the fireplace, Joanna and Colt sat at the table with warm mugs and a chessboard between them. She had never played. He was patient. "You don't have to protect every piece," he told her, watching as she tried to guard her pawns. She raised an eyebrow. "Isn't that the point?" "Sometimes it's not about what you keep," he said, moving his knight with care. "It's about what you're willing to risk." Joanna stared at the board, then up at him, and she understood. They weren't just playing a game. They were building something. Together. The next day, Colt came back from town with a surprise. 3 coats, one for each child, and one for Joanna. The children tore into the bundle with joy, but Joanna stood still, her hand gripping the fabric of hers tightly. "Too much?" Colt asked gently. "No," she whispered. "Just, no one's ever brought me something that wasn't for survival." Colt stepped closer. "This one's for staying." Her eyes filled, but she didn't cry. She just put the coat on, buttoned it slowly, and said, "Then I guess I'll stay." As winter deepened, so did their rhythm. Mira painted the barn walls with bright color. Evan insisted on helping Colt feed the horses, though he mostly dropped more feed than he poured. Joanna began writing again. Little things, lists, thoughts, then stories. Not about what she had lost, but what she was finding. And sometimes, Colt would wake in the middle of the night and find Joanna in the rocker by the fire, scribbling into a notebook. He never interrupted. He just laid another log on the fire and returned to bed, knowing she'd come back soon. One night, as they sat under thick quilts, listening to wind scratch at the shutters, Joanna turned to Colt and asked, "What made you stay alone so long?" He thought for a moment. "Because I thought I had to be someone better before I let anyone in." She touched his cheek. "You don't have to deserve a home, Colt, and neither do you," he replied softly. She didn't answer, just leaned in and kissed him. Not out of gratitude, not because she was afraid, but because she wanted to, because he was her home now too. The days began to stretch again, subtle at first, the sun lingering a little longer, shadows growing thinner, the snow melting in slow patches along the fence posts. Birds returned, timid and scattered, as if unsure whether it was safe. Joanna felt the same. She had settled in Colt's house, in his life, in his quiet strength, but part of her still woke in the night, afraid it would all be taken, that someone would knock on the door and remind her she didn't belong to peace. One morning, Colt found her sitting on the back steps, arms around her knees, staring out at the gray morning. He didn't ask what was wrong. He just sat beside her and offered a slice of bread he'd warmed in the oven. She took it, hands trembling a little. Then she asked, "What if it all disappears?" He looked out at the land as steady as ever. "Then we build it again, together." She stared at him, and he said simply, "Joanna." The way he said her name, not rushed, not soft, but with weight, made her blink, because no one had said her name like that in years, like it mattered, like she mattered. Later that day, they packed up old things from the barn. Joanna found her tattered travel bag in the loft and sat cross-legged beside it, running her fingers along the worn leather strap. "What are you thinking?" Colt asked, kneeling nearby. "I used to keep this packed in case I had to run." "And now?" She looked at it, then stood, walked to the edge of the loft, and tossed the bag down into the fire pit below. It landed with a thud in the snow. "I think it's time I unpacked, inside too." They held a small celebration that night. Mira baked a crooked pie. Evan danced in his socks. Joanna laughed so hard she cried. And Colt, quiet, steady Colt, smiled so wide the corners of his eyes crinkled for the first time in years. As the night wound down and the fire cracked low, Colt gently tucked a blanket over the sleeping children. Joanna watched him from the kitchen doorway, arms crossed, heart full. "You look like you've done that 100 times, she said. He turned to her, voice low. "I'd do it 100 more, if you'll let me." She walked to him, stood toe to toe. "You already are." That night, when they lay in bed, her back pressed to his chest, his hand gently resting over hers, Joanna whispered, "Say it again." "What?" "My name." And he did. Joanna, like a prayer, like a promise, like home. The winds returned one night, sharp and howling, but they no longer sounded like threats to Joanna. Not in this house, not with Colt beside her. The next morning, she woke up early, before the children stirred, before the fire was lit. She stepped out onto the porch, wrapped in her thick shawl, and for a moment she just stood there, letting the cold touch her skin, breathing in the stillness of a life finally hers. Behind her, the door creaked open. Colt appeared, shirt wrinkled, boots half-laced. "You all right?" he asked. "I'm more than all right," she said, not turning. "I just needed to feel the morning." Colt stepped beside her, close but not crowding. She liked that about him, how he left space for her thoughts. "I used to wake up to screaming," she said softly. "Not from others, from myself, in my head, from all the things I couldn't say." She looked up at him, but not anymore. He didn't reply, just gently took her hand and kissed her knuckles. It wasn't a grand gesture, it didn't need to be, because she didn't flinch, she didn't pull away. She let love knock, and for the first time she opened the door. Later that day, Mira brought her a folded note she'd written in blocky, uneven handwriting. "I like it here, I like Colt, I like our family, can we stay forever?" Joanna's throat tightened. She folded the note carefully and slid it into her apron pocket, holding it like a vow. That evening she sat with Colt by the fire while Evan built towers out of wooden blocks. Mira sketched their home, windows glowing, trees bending gently in the wind, 3 figures on the porch. Joanna said, "They're starting to heal," Colt asked. "And you?" She nodded. "I think I'm not waiting for the past to find me anymore." "You don't have to," he said. "The past can't get through the doors we've built." She leaned into him then, resting her head against his shoulder. "I want to build more, not just for the kids, for us." "You already are," he whispered. That night, Joanna wrote in her journal by firelight, not about pain, not about running, but about roots. She wrote of quiet mornings, of wooden fences and laughter, of a man who spoke little but gave everything, and of a woman who thought love was over for her, until it walked out of a barn and offered her warmth without condition. She closed the journal, and for the first time in her life, she believed it. She was no longer just surviving. She was living. Spring whispered before it shouted. At first, it was just the tiniest changes. Mud replacing snow near the barn, the clatter of thawed river stones, Mira coming home with daffodils in her fists. Joanna didn't notice it all at once. Healing was like that. It crept in when you weren't looking. But one morning, she stood barefoot in the kitchen, sunlight pooling on the floor like gold, and realized she felt safe. Not just protected, safe. That same day, Colt opened a door she hadn't noticed much before. It was the last room at the end of the hallway. Dusty. Forgotten. He stood in the doorway, hesitating. "I haven't touched it in years," he said. Joanna looked up from folding laundry. "What is it?" "My sister's old room. Sarah used to stay here when she visited. After she passed, I couldn't bring myself to open it." Joanna didn't push. She let silence answer. Later, after dinner, she found him standing there again. This time, the door was open. The room was small, bare, but the light fell just right through the single window, making it feel like something was waiting inside. "I was thinking," Colt said, voice low, "maybe it's time this room had life in it again." Joanna glanced at him. "You want to turn it into something?" He nodded slowly. "A room for you, a space of your own." She blinked. "Colt, I already have—" "I know," he cut in gently. "You have this house. You have us. But I want you to have something that's just yours. Not because you had to earn it, but because you deserve it." She stared at the empty room and saw for the first time in her life a space where she wasn't hiding, or surviving, or shrinking. A space where she could grow. They cleaned it out together. Mira helped dust the window. Evan crawled under the bed frame and declared it his pirate ship. Joanna found an old chest full of music sheets and ribbon scraps that once belonged to Sarah, and Colt, without words, sat with her as they folded each piece with care. By sunset, the room was clear, empty, full of promise. Joanna stood in the doorway that night, watching the breeze move the curtain, and said quietly, "I never thought I'd have a room I didn't have to escape from." Colt came up behind her and wrapped his arms around her waist. "Now it's a room you never have to leave." Later, as the children slept and the stars blinked wide over the ranch, Joanna opened her journal. She titled the page, "The Room That Waited for Me," and she wrote, not about fear, but about becoming, about the way love didn't demand space but made room, and how sometimes healing was as simple as a door left open and a voice saying, "This is yours now." The room at the end of the hallway transformed over the next few weeks. It didn't happen all at once. Just like Joanna's heart, it softened slowly. They painted the walls a dusty lavender, the kind of color that reminded her of the sky just before dusk. Mira helped pick out curtains with little wildflowers embroidered along the edges. Evan brought her rocks he said matched the window light, and she let him line them up along the sill. Joanna placed a small desk by the window, and when she finally sat at it, pen in hand, she whispered to herself, "You belong here." Colt came in one afternoon and found her at that desk, hair falling over one shoulder, journal open, sunlight spilling across the pages. He didn't say a word, just leaned on the doorframe and watched her in quiet awe. She looked up and smiled. "What?" He shook his head. "Just you, looking like peace." She laughed softly. "Feels strange, doesn't it?" "What does?" "Not bracing for the next storm." Colt stepped into the room, kneeling beside her chair. "You've walked through more storms than most ever will, Joe. And I'm still here." He nodded, taking her hand. Stronger, softer, not broken. She closed her eyes and breathed that in. Let it settle in her chest like truth finally taking root. That weekend, Colt took her and the kids into town for the spring fair. It was the first time Joanna had stepped into a crowd without flinching. She held Evan's hand in one and Mira's sketchbook in the other. She watched Colt teach them how to carve small pieces of wood at a craft's tent, his patience as deep as the sky. She realized something else that day. She wasn't just passing through this life. She was living inside it, and the world somehow had made space for her voice. Not as a whisper, not as a regret, but as something that mattered. That night, as they sat on the porch under a sky full of stars, Colt passed her a mug of warm cider. Joanna held it with both hands, the scent reminding her of safety and home. "Do you ever miss the quiet?" she asked him. Colt smiled. "I still have it. It just sounds different now." "Like?" He looked at her, at Mira giggling inside the window, at Evan snoring softly on the rug, "Like your laughter in the kitchen, your voice reading by firelight, the way your boots sound on my floorboards." She didn't answer. She just leaned into his side, and for the first time she didn't feel the need to explain herself. She didn't apologize for taking up space, because here, her voice was never too loud, it was part of the rhythm of this house, of this family, of this life she had chosen. Spring deepened. The hills bloomed in soft colors, daisies, poppies, and little blue bonnets that Mira loved to press between pages of her notebook. Birds sang again. The wind no longer howled. It hummed. Everything, it seemed, had softened. So had Joanna. But not because her pain was gone. She had simply stopped guarding it so tightly. She could speak of the past now without shaking. She could speak of the man who broke her and the nights she ran barefoot through fear, and then stop, take a breath, and tell the next part. How she had survived. How she had found Colt. And how she had started again. One day, Colt returned from the field with his hands scratched and dirt-stained from mending fences. Joanna pulled him to the kitchen sink, rolled up his sleeves, and began washing them gently. He tried to laugh it off. "I'm not made of glass, Joe." She looked up. "No, but you matter." And then her touch slowed. Because something about washing his hands, rough and worn, yes, but tender when they held her, brought tears to her eyes. He didn't flinch. He didn't ask why. He just let her cry. Let her hold his hands the way no one had held hers. That night, the kids were asleep early, and Colt lit the lanterns without a word. He made tea. She sat across from him, notebook in lap, staring down at a blank page. "I want to write something that's not about pain," she whispered. He looked up, quiet as always. "Then write about what you found," he said. She smiled. "I found you." He gave her that rare, boyish grin she loved, the one that only showed up when he felt deeply. "No," he said. "You found yourself. I was just lucky enough to be nearby." Later, as they lay in bed, the window cracked open to let in the cool scent of earth and stars. Joanna turned toward him. "Do you ever worry this will go away?" she asked. Colt pulled her into his arms, their legs tangled under the quilt. "No," he said simply, "because I won't let it." "But what if I still break sometimes?" "Then I'll hold the pieces until you're ready again." She buried her face in his chest and whispered, "You always know what to say." "I don't say much," he murmured, "but I've got strong hands." She smiled, because she knew his hands had never hurt her. They had never demanded, never pushed, never taken. They only held, and they always would. It was a warm morning when Joanna woke to laughter outside. She peeked through the window and saw Colt chasing Evan through the garden, pretending to be a bear. Mira stood nearby with her sketchbook, giggling so hard she could barely draw. The ranch, once so still and solitary, now echoed with life. Joanna wrapped a shawl around her shoulders and stepped outside barefoot. The earth was soft beneath her toes, and the air smelled of fresh soil and early blooms. Colt looked up and smiled, breathless, his hat askew. "You're missing the fun," he said. "I am the fun," she replied, and everyone laughed. But behind her words was something real. She wasn't watching the world anymore. She was part of it. Later, while Evan napped and Mira read on the porch swing, Colt found Joanna in the barn. She was sorting through boxes, pulling out pieces of the past she no longer needed. Old shoes worn thin from running, a threadbare scarf that still smelled like old fear. He didn't interrupt, just waited until she looked up and said, "I think I'm finally ready." "For what?" he asked. She walked over, stood in front of him, and took his hand. "To stop thinking this is temporary. To stop wondering when it will all fall apart. To stop waiting to be sent away." Colt's eyes didn't waver. "You've always had a place here." She shook her head, voice trembling. "I mean more than that." Then she took a breath and said, "I want to build something with you. Something that has my name on it, too. Not just your kindness, not just your house, our home." A long pause. Then he said, "Then let's start now." And in that moment, without a ring, without a vow, without a witness but the birdsong outside, Joanna chose to stay, and Colt chose her back. That evening they gathered at the kitchen table with the children. Joanna made stew. Mira set the table with wildflowers, and Colt lit the lanterns. It was quiet. It was simple, but to Joanna it felt like a cathedral. After the dishes were cleared and the fire crackled low, she looked around the room and whispered the words she had never dared speak in any house before. "This is home." Colt looked up from where Evan was curled against his chest. "Yeah," he said, "it is." She smiled at him. Her rancher, the man who never asked for more than she could give, but gave her more than she had ever known. And when she looked back down at the table where her children sat safe and warm, Joanna didn't feel like a woman who had survived something. She felt like a woman who had arrived. Months passed, and the land shifted with the seasons. Spring gave way to summer, with golden light draping the hills and the grass waving like oceans in the breeze. The ranch, once a place Colt had filled with silence, now rang with laughter, footsteps, and the clatter of dishes shared by 4, sometimes 5, hearts beating together. Joanna stood in the doorway one evening, watching the sun dip low over the fields. Evan was crouched near the fence, whispering secrets to a new calf. Mira sat on the porch steps, sketching with charcoal smudges on her cheeks. Behind her, Colt was repairing the latch on the screen door, his sleeves rolled up and his hat pushed back. "Need anything?" he asked without looking up. Joanna smiled. "I have everything." The house no longer felt like something she had to tiptoe through. Her photos were on the wall now. Mira's drawings hung beside old horseshoe hooks. Evan had made a mess of the pantry more than once, and Colt had grumbled, but his eyes always smiled. One day, Colt carved something into the beam over the front door. He wouldn't show her until it was done. When she finally looked, her breath caught. "Safe, always." No names, no date, just 2 words that meant more than any promise. Autumn rolled in slowly. Mornings cooled, and the leaves painted the sky with fire. Colt taught Evan how to ride. Mira joined Joanna in the garden, their hands deep in the soil. They baked bread together. They mended old blankets. They laughed easily now. And on a Sunday morning, after the first frost kissed the ground, Colt handed Joanna a small box. Inside was a ring. Nothing grand, just a smooth silver band engraved with tiny wildflowers. He said, "You don't have to wear it. I just wanted you to know I'm not going anywhere." Joanna touched the band and whispered, "I never thought I'd belong to someone without being owned." He cupped her cheek, his eyes steady. "You don't belong to me. You belong with me." She kissed him then, slow and certain, and said yes, not just to the ring, but to everything. The wedding was quiet, just them and the kids. A few friends from town. A warm breeze. A guitar. Someone played softly. Mira wore flowers in her hair, and Evan carried a ribbon they tied around their hands. Joanna didn't wear white. She wore blue, strong, steady like sky. They didn't promise forever. They promised this: to wake each day and try. To speak gently. To hold each other even when it was hard. To be the home they never had before. That night, Colt and Joanna sat on the porch, just the 2 of them. "You think it'll last?" she asked, teasing. Colt looked at her, his eyes full of light and dust and something deeper. "It already has," he said. And Joanna, once a woman who ran from shadows, leaned into the arms that never closed around her too tightly, and whispered, "We were the family the storm left behind, and we made something better from the wreckage." And in the distance, the wind carried no threats, only peace. Only home?